Hello, people of YouTube, and welcome to my YouTube show, Ruben's History Show. So, today I am going to talk about the life after the Soviet era, which started in 1991 following the dissolvement of the Soviet Union on December 26, 1991. And the history of the life after the Soviet era still continues to this very day, still to the present day. So the life after the Soviet era began in 1991 following the dissolvement of the Soviet Union when Gorbachev resigned as the General Secretary or the President of the Soviet Union in 1991. So one of the reasons why USSR came down was because of the war in Afghanistan was still going on. The Soviet-Afghan war was taking place, which continued from 1979. That was when the Soviet war in Afghanistan started, when the government of Leonid Brezhnev invaded Afghanistan in 1979 on December 24th, 1979, which was Christmas morning. No, I think it was the Christmas morning during that time. It was December of 1979. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And then the war lasted for about 10 years, and then it ended on February 15th, 1989, when the last of the Soviet troops withdrew or came out of Afghanistan by the order of Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union during that time, which basically meant he was the leader of the nation. So then by like the late 80s, Soviet Union was starting to come down because the economy was still stagnating because of the war in Afghanistan, and Soviet troops were dying in the war in Afghanistan during that period. And so by the early 90s, some of the Soviet republics started to declare their independence, like the Ukraine, Belarusia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Georgia and Azerbaijan started to declare their independence from the Soviet Union. And then later on in 1991, Soviet Union came down in December of 1991. But 2 years prior, other bunch of Eastern communist countries started to come down. The Eastern Europe countries started to come down. By 1989, 1990, a bunch of communist governments in the Eastern Europe started to come down. For example, like Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Yugoslavia governments, communist governments started to collapse because this communism started to collapse in the Eastern Europe. And by 1991, Soviet Union came down when Gorbachev resigned as the president of the Soviet Union during that period. And so, but months prior to Gorbachev resigning was on June 12th, 1991. Boris Yeltsin was elected the president of Russia, the first president in Russian history to be elected as the president of Russia during that period. And so Yeltsin would held the position of president all the way until December 31st, 1991, when he was succeeded by Vladimir Putin in 1991. And he would be the president for just 8 years. And so and Yeltsin made Soviet Union come down together with Gorbachev during that time. But then in August of 1991, that was when the 1991 August coup took place, which was to overthrow Gorbachev from power, and he was placed under house arrest. Gorbachev was during that time, and he was placed under house arrest for some time. He was in his house, and Soviet police started to place Gorbachev under house arrest during that time. And so Soviet Union broke down in December of 1991 when Gorbachev resigned as the president of the USSR. And so the Soviet Union collapsed, and all other former 15 republics of Soviet Union became independent from the Soviet Union. And so, and then after that, the Russia was the successor to the Soviet Union. And so today, Russia is known as the Russian Federation, which still remains there today. And so there was a lot of stuff has changed during the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 because capitalism has took over in Russia, and now Russia is capitalism today. And so now there was some now after that Yeltsin was elected president before the Soviet Union collapsed, and then he was president for some time, and there was no power in Armenia whatsoever because of the communist government of the Soviet Union gave the order to give the Armenian people no power, and there was no power during in the Armenia after the fall of the Soviet Union for probably maybe 2 or 1 years. There was no electricity in that country, in Armenia, which was one of the 15 Soviet republics during that period. And there was no lights, no TV whatsoever after Soviet Union came down. And so a lot of laws were changed. So because a lot of laws changed, and some people say that some people may have their own opinion about which life was better before the Soviet era or during the Soviet era. So from my point of view, I would probably say the life after the Soviet era is much better because there's not laws saying that, for example, if you don't go to work without any good reason, you could be arrested and you could be sentenced to prison for not showing up to work. So that's not going on in Russia now. But then it was during the Soviet Union time in the 1980s. During the 1980s, the early 80s, after the Brezhnev died, that started taking place during that time, during the Andropov time, when Andropov was leader of the country. And so, and then during that era, this Russian people were free they could get out of the country and go to whatever country they want, for like United States or something, or any other country. They could travel to any other countries in Europe and or in the United States or somewhere else. And so after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had the Chechen Wars, which was no the first Chechen War, which took place between 1994, I believe. That was 1994 when the first Chechen War began. It was thought between the Islamic Chechen forces and against the Russians or the Russian Federation troops. That took place in 1991, 1992, 1994 actually, because Russian President Yeltsin sent troops over to Chechnya because the Chechens wanted to declare their independence from Russia. They wanted to be free from Russia because Chechnya was a part of the Russia, and they wanted to be separate from Russia. They wanted to declare their independence from the Russia. And so Yeltsin gave the order to the Russian troops to fight, to enter in Chechnya, and to prevent the Chechens from declaring their independence from the Russia. And so by 1994 or 1995, I believe, between those 2 years, the Battle of Grozny took place, which was when which is the capital of Chechnya. Grozny is the capital of Chechnya. And so, yeah, Grozny is the capital of Chechnya. And so there was the battle took place. It was between 1994 and 1995, that was. and that was when and then after the battle, the Russian forces managed to capture the city, and the Groznya was under Russian control. And it was the heaviest bombing campaign in Europe since World War II. During that time, after World War II ended in 1945. But then the war ended in August of 1996 when the Chechen Spetsnaz captured regained Grozny, and that's how the first Chechen War ended, and that's how basically the Chechen War ended. So the Chechen War almost basically lasted for about 2 years, from 1994 to 1996, and the Russian troops withdrew from Chechnya the Russian troops after the Russian troops were defeated in Chechnya when the Chechens retook Grozny in 1996. And so that's how the war in Chechnya that's how the first war in Chechnya ended. Also, the first Chechen War included airstrikes and air support, and it also included firepower like guns used in the first Chechen War. And so and then years later, the second Chechen War would start, which was in 1999. But before that, there was the elections in Russia, which was the 1996 Russian presidential elections, which was to elect the new president of Russia. And so it was Boris Yeltsin who ran for the president of Russia, and it was also Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the former General Secretary or the president of the Soviet Union, and the Russian presidential elections took place on June 15th or 16th, no, June 16th of 1996, and then on I think it was about July 3rd of 1996, Gorbachev won the election as the Russian president of the nation. And so he was the president all the way until 1999, when he was replaced by Vladimir Putin, who would later become the president of Russia, and he's still the president of Russia to this very day still. So later on in the 1990s, or I think it was late 90s, because that was when Russian people didn't get paid. They didn't get paid enough during that time. They didn't get paid enough, and they didn't get the money they deserved. And so Russian people were very upset about it. And there was this constitutional crisis, which was, I think it was between 1990, the early 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union took place during that time. And so a lot of people were mad at the Russian government during that time. And they were very upset during that period. And so later on in 1999, that was when the second Chechen War began, when the Islamic forces, Islamic Chechens, began to invade Dagestan, which is located in Russia, which is like Chechnya. And so that's how the second Chechen War began. That was fought between the Russian forces and the Chechen forces. And that war would last for about 1 year, from 1999 all the way to 2000, which was fought between the Russian forces and the Chechen forces. And that would last for about 1 year. And so after that, the conflict in Chechnya would still continue between the Russians and the Chechens, and it would still continue to this very day still. The Russian and Chechen forces would still be fighting each other in the Chechnya to this very day still. And so they would be fighting each other in the mountains during that period, and they would fight against each other. And so the war continues, and the war ended in 1990, in 2000, because that was when the Russians won the war. won the second Chechen wars, the second Chechen war in 2000. And so Chechen forces lost the war in 2000, and so the war would continue all the way to this very day still. And there was still a conflict in Chechnya between the Russians and the Chechen forces during that time. And so later on, and then by December 1991, that was when Vladimir Putin became the president of the Russia during that period. And so, and then also during the Chechen War, that was when this apartment bombings took place in the Chechnya during that time by this Chechen Muslims. And so they started. There was this apartment bombings in Moscow and other cities in Russia, which were organized by the Chechen forces during that period. And so they would, and Russians would fight against the Chechens during that period. So, yep. So I'm planning to make more topics on the life after the Soviet era, and so I'll see you guys in the next video. Please drop a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.